Let's get into our study for tonight. We're talking in the vein of giving. We're talking about giving and in connection with the prosperity gospel. And we've come now to the subject of, we've really come to a new heading under that. What does the Bible actually teach about giving? Specifically, what I want to get into tonight is that question of the tithe. I would love to be able to get this all in one study, but we'll just see how it goes. Essentially, if I can just remind us where we've come to in our study, we began by talking about, well, we're in a whole subcategory for over a year now. It's been more like 2 years, I guess. We've been doing false theologies, false churches, teachings that are so bad that they result in a church being a false church, not even a true church, because they'd compromised their gospel presentation. And in that vein, we're talking about the prosperity gospel, which certainly is a false gospel. And it teaches that in connection with the gospel, you are promised to have health and wealth, provided you check off the boxes. You have enough faith and give enough money, usually the two things at the top of the list. So we've talked about the health side of things. We've talked about the wealth side of things. We've shown that all of the verses in the Bible on the wealth side of things, all of them, there's not a single one of all the ones that even we tend to assume do teach that God will give you money in response to you giving money to a ministry or to a church. We've seen that actually none of those verses teach that. Even the one that talks about if you sow, you will reap, isn't talking about reaping money back. It's talking about other blessings that you reap in return for sowing. And the sowing in that instance we saw in 2 Corinthians was indeed giving, but the reaping was not financial reaping. And so it's interesting how all of these verses, every single one has fallen short. So I think we have kind of come to the conclusion that, look, this is not the motivation for which we give. And there's no promise of God to Christians who are faithful enough or have enough faith or whatever that they are going to be rich. That doesn't mean that there's a promise that you're going to be poor, but it's not un-Christian for you to be poor, if that's the case. Now, in a country like America, where in general, those who work hard are not poor, that does say something about you, and it's true. We kind of generally think of people as being lazy if they're poor, and often we're correct in that assumption. So you say, well, you're making assumptions. Well, yeah, but you have to make assumptions sometimes. You have to operate on the basis of assumptions, and often we're correct. In a country like ours, typically that is the case, but that's not always the case, and certainly is not part of what we're talking about in the Scripture as far as the command of God. We're talking, does God say, if you'll do this, I'll make you financially wealthy? And that promise is not there in the New Testament. We've seen that. Now, there's one verse left that'll be used for this, and it's the tithe verse. So I've kind of saved it for this under this heading, and that's Malachi chapter 3. So if you'll turn there, now we've talked about what the Bible doesn't teach about tithing, about giving, and now we're under what does the Bible actually teach. But there's really one more thing we have to say it doesn't teach under the what does it actually teach about giving, and that is this idea of the tithe. We've said that it doesn't teach that you're going to give and get something in return, something financially in return. But this verse on the tithe seems to suggest otherwise. Let's read it. Malachi chapter 3, verse 8. Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. You are robbing God, according to this verse, or the audience who's hearing this verse is robbing God by not bringing tithes, and if they would bring the tithes, they would receive a blessing so much that there wouldn't be room enough to receive it. Now, before I dive into this subject, this is dangerous waters for a pastor, no matter where he lands, really. This is something that I realized about 5 years ago. And 3 years ago when I became a pastor, I said, let's wait on this subject for a little while. Let's not do this one just yet. And that's because I know that there are people, even in our number, who will disagree. There's probably, just my guess would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50-50 on whether or not God has commanded Christians to pay a tithe. Now, let me say before we jump in that what we're not saying, or what I'm not going to say, is, number one, I'm not going to say that tithing is bad. I'm not going to say that, okay? What we're asking is tithing a command of God to Christians? I'm going to say no to that. If you come to a different conclusion, feel free to be honest. Don't think you have to go whispering about the pastor behind his back. It's fine. It's fine for you to think differently than me on this. On really anything, but this is definitely one of those things. It's fine. But what I'm not going to come to the conclusion of, I'm not going to say that tithing is wrong. I'm not going to say that tithing shouldn't be or couldn't be a standard for a church. A church couldn't say, hey, look, we have regular bills we have to pay, and so we're asking that our members, as they're able to, bring 10% of their income, if they're able to help us so we can have a regular income into the church and pay the bills that we regularly have to pay. That's certainly perfectly fine. That's not what we're asking. We're not saying whether or not that is wrong. We're asking, is it a commandment of God? I mean, when someone gets up and starts teaching on tithing and they say, if you can't pay your electric bill and you choose to pay the electric bill instead of paying the tithe, you've robbed God, and you are going to be worse off financially because you didn't pay the tithe and you paid the electric bill. We're asking, is that true? Is that really the attitude we ought to have towards giving? And I think the answer is no. And if you disagree, just hear me out, and then feel free to continue to disagree with me. So Malachi chapter 3 does give an instance where people who were not tithing were robbing God. And if they would tithe, God would bring great financial blessings to them. That is true. But let's remember, Malachi 3 was not written to me. It was not written to you. It was written to Israel. So remember the covenant that God had with Israel. He made this covenant with Abraham. He said, I'm going to make of you a great nation, and in thee shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Meaning the Messiah is going to come through this nation, and then all the nations are going to end up being blessed because of the Messiah. We are beneficiaries of that great nation, that great promise to the nation of Israel. Now, the Messiah is to bring a kingdom, right? So the purpose for the people of Israel was to hang on to land and be prosperous and be a prosperous, successful nation so they could defend their borders, so they could have a country when the Messiah showed up and they could deliver the kingdom over to him where he could reign. That was their perspective on it. And it's accurate, though they didn't understand how the prophecy was all going to play out, right? But the idea is that God was withholding blessing at many times throughout the history of the nation of Israel because they were not following his law. And his deal with them, if you read the book of Deuteronomy, he said, listen, I've given you the law, now go and obey it. And if you obey it, your nation is going to be prosperous. If you disobey it, your nation is going to be cursed. And now, here in Malachi, this is after they've disobeyed the law and been in the time of judges for all this time. Then they get kings and they follow when they have a good king, and then all of a sudden they disobey the law when they have a bad king, and finally they're thrown into captivity with the Babylonians, and then they come back from captivity when the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and they're finally back in the land, and this is about 100 years after that, coming back from captivity. Now Malachi is saying, listen, you guys are back to it again. You're back to disobeying the law, and you're being cursed by God again. And so throughout the book of Malachi, you'll actually see 6 different claims, objections, and responses. That's the way I list it, COR. It's a claim, an objection, and a response. A claim, objection, and a response. God makes a claim about something that the people of Israel are doing that is breaking his law. He gives the objection that he knows that they'll give, and then he responds to their objection. You can see a couple of them in chapter 1, verse 2. He says, I have loved you, saith the Lord. Yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? And then he responds all the way down through verse 6. In verse 6, you see another one near the end of verse 6. He says, "O priests, you've despised my name," right? And ye say, "Wherein have we despised thy name? Ye offer polluted bread on my altar." And he keeps going. That's number 2. And number 3 is found in verse 12. "Ye have profaned it." That means to profane his altar. "The table of the Lord is polluted. The fruit even of his meat is contemptible. Ye said also, Behold, what weirdness is it? And how, and ye have snuffed at it, saith the Lord." And so there's their objection, his claim, their objection, and then he gives a response going forward. Number 4 is found in chapter 2 and verse 17. "Ye have wearied the Lord with your words. Ye say, Wherein have we wearied him? When ye say, Everyone that doeth evil is good in the sight of the Lord." And this is number 5 in a list of claims, objections, and responses that God is giving to the people of Israel. All of them are specific to the people of Israel, and even to some of them specifically to the priests there in Israel, the religious leaders. And the final one you'll see in verse 13. "Your words have been stout against me, saith the Lord, yet ye say, What have we spoken so much against thee?" And he goes on to respond to it. So this is clearly God dealing with Israel on the basis of the covenant that he made with Israel. So then, what we don't have here is a command for Christians in the church to bring a tithe. Nor do we have a promise that Christians in the church will receive financial blessings if they pay a tithe. We've already seen numerous passages in the New Testament that people have claimed say that you'll get financial blessings if you give to God, and we've examined them, and they talk a lot about how you're blessed because you're able to give to God, and you should give because you're already blessed, but none of them say that you're going to get financial blessing because of your giving. We've already seen that already. So then we've got to just ask ourselves, what is the deal with this tithe thing? So let's respond to some of the arguments that people will make who believe that the tithe is a command to the church. Now, here's what they're going to need to do. The first thing that would be really nice for somebody who thinks the tithe is a command to Christians in the church, it'd be really nice if somewhere in the New Testament to a church, someone told the church to tithe, but you're not going to find that anywhere. That's nowhere in the New Testament. Let's go to the only place in the New Testament where the tithe is mentioned. It's in Matthew 23. And the parallel passage in the book of Luke, chapter 11, verse 42. These are the only 2 mentions of the tithe. They're both talking about the same thing. It's Christ's condemnation of the Pharisees. In Matthew 23, I'll read to you in verse 23. He's giving a list of woes to the scribes and Pharisees. And he says this in 23, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These," that means the tithe, "ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." Well, the Pharisees were not believers. They were not part of the church. And they were not tithing to the church. Right? They were bringing tithes to the temple. And really, it wasn't so much about them giving the tithe as much as it was commanding others to give the tithe, because the tithe was received by the religious leaders, and they lived off of this. So, especially one named Annas, who was known for his incredible corruption during the time of Jesus. He was so corrupt that he was removed as high priest by the Romans because he had way too much power as like some sort of godfather, there in Jerusalem. And so Annas made sure that his son-in-law, Caiaphas, got the job after him so that his operation could continue. The point is that Jesus is not telling the Jews that they were wrong to tithe because he had commanded the Jews to tithe. But he's saying, you've missed the weightier matters of the law. None of this really has to do with whether or not the church, Christians in the church, should be tithing, or whether they're commanded to tithe. Whether they should be or not is not really the issue. The question is, are they commanded by God to tithe? And that's not here. So then the only reference in the New Testament, which is where the church is found in the New Testament, does not command the church to tithe. It just doesn't. So then if you believe that the tithe is a command to the church, you're going to have to go to the Old Testament to do it. And what you're going to have to do is say that the Old Testament commands to tithe never stopped. They just continue on to us today. You have a couple problems with that. First of all, the Old Testament commands to tithe, we're going to dive into them in just a moment, but they're not to Gentiles. Like God, often in the Old Testament, he will give prophecy to Gentile nations. Hey, you guys are worshiping false gods. Hey, you guys are in idolatry and lust and all of this kind of stuff. And he'll bring all kinds of accusations against the Gentiles. But never one time does he say, you haven't paid tithe. I mean, that's never mentioned. Of all the condemnation of the Gentiles in the Old Testament, they were never expected to pay tithe. So then a person who says that it is for Gentiles, they'll have to go further back. They'll have to go to Genesis chapter 14. With me to Genesis 14, and we'll talk about the first time tithe is mentioned in the Bible. And this will kind of open up what the tithe was. So the tithe, I'm going to argue that the tithe was a specific command to a specific people for a specific purpose. It was a specific command to a specific people for a specific purpose. And none of those things are things that we want to incorporate in our church today. We just want to say the tithe is a command to God, or some people do. But we don't want to have any of the things that are connected with the tithe. We don't do any of that. If we actually study what the tithe was in the Old Testament, we'll see that what we imagine is a command to Christians in the church today is nothing like what the Bible describes when it describes tithe. So let's see what the Bible describes as tithe, and we'll do that by looking at this. Now, the argument, of course, from Genesis 14 is that this is before the law. And if Abraham gives tithe before the law is instituted, then obviously it's a command that's not just confined to the law. It's outside of the law, so it's for everyone. Well, let's just read what it says here. This is after Abraham has fought with the conglomerate of kingdoms and nations that had come and conquered those city-states in and around Sodom and Gomorrah in the plains. And his nephew Lot was taken captive in that. So he gathered up a band of his servants, and he had 300 fighting-age servants, which tells you how wealthy Abraham was. He's a very wealthy man. And he took 300 of his fighting-age servants and went after and conquered these kings. Of course, that was like impossible. How could he with 300 guys? Well, it's because God was with him. And so when he comes back from the battle, it says this in verse 17, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and of the kings that were with him in the vale of Sheva, which is the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Now, we don't need to get into Melchizedek. Some people say he was an actual human who was a priest in that time, who was actually worshiping the true God, Yahweh. And others say that he's actually a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. And I think both of those have merit. We don't need to get into the argument for the study tonight. At any rate, he comes forth and brings bread and wine, which seems to symbolize the Passover meal, right? But verse 19 says, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand, and he gave him tithes of all. That's clearly Abraham giving Melchizedek tithes of all of the loot that he got during this battle. Now, what does he do with the rest of the loot? Well, it says this, and the king of Sodom said unto Abraham, give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. Just give me all the people, and you take all the wealth that was stolen from us, you can have it. And Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. Save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. Now, these were three men who joined in with Abraham's lot, and so they needed to be paid for their work, right? But essentially what happens here is Abraham meets a priest of Yahweh God, whether he's just a man or Jesus, a pre-incarnate version of Jesus is not important. But he meets this priest, and the priest blesses him and says, listen, this was God who gave you the victory in this battle. And Abraham then, knowing that this man must be truly speaking on God's behalf, gives him 10% of all of the loot that had been stolen from Sodom and Gomorrah that he's now recovered. He gives him 10% of that, and what does he do with the rest of it? gives it all back to Sodom and Gomorrah and to those cities. Because he doesn't want to be made wealthy, but he doesn't want people to say, well, he's only wealthy because of Sodom and Gomorrah. He wants everyone to know he's wealthy because God has made him wealthy. In fact, we know Abraham is already very wealthy. He has 300, just his fighting age servants are 300. That means he's got to have, 500-600 servants, something like that, maybe more. I mean, he's a very wealthy individual, okay? He owns a shepherding empire, if you will, And guess what? Guess what Abraham doesn't do? He does not give tithes of all of his income. I mean, he's got a lot of wealth. He does not give 10% of everything he owns. This isn't a discussion about what happens to the loot he just got. He didn't even go home. He could have said, hey, hang on right here. I'm going to send a servant to go home and get some of my wealth and bring it here. He doesn't do that. He gives tithe of what he got. This is essentially, if we were to apply this to today, the best example would be a police officer who sees a woman and this man comes by and he grabs the woman's purse and he runs off into a dark alley and the police officer runs after him. And the police officer grabs the woman's purse from the guy and, puts him in handcuffs, And before he gives the woman back her purse, he first takes 10% of all the money and gives it to the church. That would be how we would, follow this pattern, okay? This has nothing to do with Abraham tithing of his income, right? This is Abraham giving 10% of the money that was going back to Sodom and Gomorrah because he knew they were wicked and saying, really, this belongs to God. But I'll give it back to you guys just so we don't have a fight on our hands, okay? I don't want any of it myself. So this isn't a pattern for us because there's no tithing of our income here. It isn't a command for us because there was no command on Abraham to do this. He chose to do it anyway. And God later, when he institutes the order to tithe in the commandment, is going to draw on Abraham's giving as a pattern for Israel. Why? Because Abraham is the father of the nation, right? He's the beginning of the nation of Israel. And so him tithing of his own free will, because he chose to, becomes a pattern that God expects for the people of Israel. So what we don't have here is a command that we can apply and say this is for everyone. All right, well, let's look at the actual laws of tithing. All right? Buckle in, get your thinking caps on, as my teacher when I was in the teen class back at my old church used to say. Let's look at this. What is the tithe? I said it was for a specific it was a specific command to a specific people. Let's talk about the specific command. There were 3 tithes in the law. 3 tithes. The first time we see the tithe in the law is in Leviticus 27. Now, this is a tax on the firstborn of all livestock. This is in Leviticus 27, verse 26. I know Leviticus has pages that are sticky because you don't go there very often. Same for me, I'm the same way. Okay, Leviticus, if I have to go to Leviticus, I'm going to do my online Bible. I don't use my real Bible. I get lost in Leviticus. Okay, Leviticus 27, verse 26, which says this, only the firstling of the beasts, which should be the Lord's firstling, no man shall sanctify it, whether it be ox or sheep, it is the Lord's. And if it be of an unclean beast, then shall he redeem it according to thine estimation, and shall add a 5th part of it thereto. Or if it be not redeemed, then it shall be sold according to thy estimation. Notwithstanding, no devoted thing that a man shall devote unto the Lord of all that he hath, both of man and of beast, and of the field of his possession, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing that is most holy unto the Lord. None devoted which shall be devoted of men shall be redeemed, but shall surely be put to death. And the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. So the tithe is included with this redeeming of the firstborn. Anytime you had a firstborn coming from a certain cow or a firstborn coming from a certain what do they call the female sheep? I don't know. A sheep. A ewe, right? Ewe, whatever. whenever you had a firstborn, that was God's. And if you wanted to keep it, you would have to redeem it. So you'd have to give it back. And the tithe was also God's. So here's the command. That's mine. Don't give it to me. You've robbed me. So that's what he's pulling on in Malachi. You've robbed God. You haven't brought what I've said is mine from the land. I gave you the land. I gave you the promises. I gave you all this stuff. You owe me the tithe. That was the deal from the beginning in Leviticus. Now, what was the tithe? Okay, there were 3 tithes in the land of Israel. And let me summarize them for you. There was a tithe for the priest, the one that we recognize regularly. There was a tithe for feast days, and there was a tithe for your local town. Let me give you a couple references here so we can go to them. Let's see. I'm going to skip a couple of the things we know about tithing just so that we understand. But let me just summarize them very quickly. First of all, tithes were only to be brought to Jerusalem. The yearly tithe was not to be given anywhere else but in Jerusalem. So that's not a pattern we can follow, is it? We can't follow the go to Jerusalem and bring your tithes to this day, right? If this command is for us today, we need to go to Jerusalem and give Jerusalem 10% of our income, right? If you want to do that, go for it. But I don't think that anyone thinks that that's a command for us today. Let's do the yearly tithe that we see in Numbers 18. Okay, so here's one of the tithes. The Levites were to collect this, and it was to be brought to Jerusalem in Deuteronomy 12, 1 through 11. I'm going to go to Numbers 18. So this is the one we often recognize. When we think about tithe, we think about this tithe. Numbers 18, 23. But the Levites shall do the service of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations that among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. But the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer as an heave offering unto the Lord, I have given to the Levites to inherit. Therefore I have said unto them, among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. So the Levites, who were separated to do all the administration of all the religious and political things in Israel, had to be compensated somehow. Right? They had to make a living. And their living was the tithes of the people. This was essentially a tax. We don't think of it as a tax because the Levites were religious leaders, but they were also enacting the law of God. Remember that this is a theocracy. There's law and religion together in the nation of Israel. So this is the only way to keep the government running. Somebody has to pay these guys who are essentially the judges and the political leaders as well as the religious leaders. So the tithe was a tax to support the government. It was to keep the government running, to keep the Levites paid and care for the Levites. Now, that was the regular 1-year tithe that was to be brought to Jerusalem, and you can read about it being brought to Jerusalem in Deuteronomy 12, 1 through 11. Let's move on to another tithe that was to be taken every year in Deuteronomy 14. So we have the yearly tithe, and then we have another yearly tithe, but this is to fund the feast days. Look what it says in Deuteronomy 14 and verse 22. Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and the firstling of thy herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. It says, you will eat it. Verse 23, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God. Now, who else is going to eat with you? Well, look at what it says, verse 24. And if thy way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name, that's Jerusalem, there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then thou shalt turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shall go into the place where the Lord thy God shall choose, and thou shalt bestow thy money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth. And thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household. And the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him, for he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. Okay, so you had to take 10% of your income and turn it in to support the Levites, to keep the government running. Okay? Then you took another 10% of your income and you set it aside for all the feast days that they had from time to time throughout the year. And there was two specific moments of feast days, two times when you would normally go to Jerusalem. That's around the time of Passover. There's several feasts around the time of Passover, and then around the time of the Feast of Tabernacles and the Day of Atonement in the other half of the year. So you had really two main times when there's like weeks of feasting. And what you were to do, this was not a tithe really for everyone. This is for, you were to take care of your house. So whoever's the one who's got the most in the house, he's going to set aside 10% of it, and then he's going to provide for his whole house. So if you're a business owner, your employees or your servants aren't going to be setting aside. You're going to be setting aside from your business, and this is your holiday money that you're going to spend on your holiday parties, You're going to get together and you're going to have a big feast off of 10% every year, several feasts off of the 10%. And those feasts are to be enjoyed not just by you and your house, but any Levite around. The Levites are supposed to just join in on your feasts. And they don't have to bring their own 10% because they're being supported off the 10%. They're not bringing 10%. They're just invited to partake and to join in. And the implication is, of course, that any poor or person who can't care for themselves is also going to be able to join in. And so those who are able to provide for feasting are then setting aside 10% of their income for feasting so that they can feast and bring in anyone else who can't feast on these feast days. So now we have 20% to tithes that are to be set aside for the Lord, but this one's for the Lord for you to enjoy. That's interesting how that works. The second one is for you to enjoy with others in Israel, but it's for the Lord. It's a way to honor God. It's interesting now, we don't ever see this as a command of God to us, but we actually if you bend your mind a little bit, we kind of do that a little bit in our church, right? Like every Sunday, which would be the 1/7 of all of our dinners, we share together. Those who have enough to bring food, bring it and share it with everyone else who can't. It's somewhat similar, right? It's not 1/10, it's 1/7, but we don't see that as a command of God. I would like to make it a command of God, but it's not. That was to Israel, right? That wasn't something we were commanded to do. So there's two tithes then that we've seen. There's another tithe. Let me give you the other tithe. This is every third year. So Deuteronomy 14 continues. Look at verse 28. At the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year. So here's another tithe. Thou shalt bring forth the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shall lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he hath seen, this is within thy gates. The other two tithes, one of them you had to bring to Jerusalem to support the Levites and the priests. The other one you had to bring to Jerusalem for the feast days, and if you couldn't keep it until the feast days or it's too long of a journey, then you can sell it, get money, then go to Jerusalem and buy whatever you wanted and feast in Jerusalem. Okay? This one, you lay it up in your gates, in your town, in your city. Okay? So it's a different tithe. Thou shalt bring forth, verse 29, and the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow. So the orphans and the widows, those who, not just the poor who can't go out and get a job and work to take care of themselves. That's what it means when it says fatherless and widows. It's saying not just any poor person, but the poor who are not lazy, the ones who can't provide for themselves. That's why they're poor. The Levite and the fatherless and the widow, which are within thy gates in your city, shall come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thy hand which thou doest. So every 3 years they had another tithe. So this would be per year. This would be 3 1/3%, right? You take 10% over 3 years and divide it by 3, right? So every 3 years, they'd have another 10% that they laid up, and this was their local tax, if you will. And this local tax went to take care of the Levites in your local town, and also to provide for the poor and the widows, and the fatherless, especially the widows and the fatherless. And so these are similar categories of people that the church takes care of. Very similar. We'll talk more about that when we get to what the church is commanded to do. But that is the tithe in the Old Testament. So it's a very specific command. None of these things are things we think are commanded to us in the church today. And yet we say, well, yeah, but the tithe is commanded to the church. Well, what tithe? Which one? Which tithe is commanded to the church today? And why is it not told? Why are we not told that in the New Testament? Well, I don't think people who believe that the tithe is a command to believers in the church have ever thought about that question. In fact, that's where I was 5 years ago, before I had ever thought about it. I mean, it's fine to default to certain views until you studied it out. There's nothing wrong with that. But here we are, we're studying it out. Okay, so it's a specific command. It's to specific people. We've already talked about that. The law was given to the nation of Israel, and the tithe was a national and a civil law. This was to take care of the poor in their country. It was to take care of the Levites, who were the political as well as the religious leaders. This was not to take care of their local synagogue, which they didn't have until later, until the intertestamental period. That's when synagogues started. But that's not what the tithe did. It didn't go to take care of the synagogues. That's not at all the case. The synagogue would be closer to our church. It would be a closer example. That's not what the tithe was for. So it's a specific command to a specific people for a specific purpose. Deuteronomy 4, 1 through 8, the other nations did not receive the law of God to Israel. Turn back with me to Deuteronomy chapter 4. There's a statement in here in Deuteronomy chapter 4 that the other nations were not given the law of God. Now, there's moral principles that God has for all people that are contained in the law to Israel. But he specifically did not give this law to all nations. This was specifically to Israel. Look what it says in Deuteronomy 4, verses 1 through 8. Now therefore hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and to the judgments which I teach you, for to do them, that ye may live and go in and possess the land which the Lord your God of your fathers giveth you. Ye shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall ye diminish aught from it, that ye may keep the commandments of the Lord your God which I command you. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did because of Baal Peor, for the men that followed Baal Peor, the Lord thy God hath destroyed them from among you. But ye did cleave unto the Lord your God. Ye that did cleave unto the Lord your God are alive, every one of you, to this day. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that ye should go do so in the land whithersoever ye go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations which hear all these statutes and say, surely this is a great nation. This great nation is wise and understanding. For what nation is there so great, who God hath so nigh unto them? As the Lord our God is in all things we call upon him for. And what nation is there so great that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as this law which I set before you this day? The point that God was making is that he didn't give the law to all the other nations. The other nations were to look at Israel and say, wow, that's brilliant, that's wonderful. But they weren't to say, we all have to join Israel. In fact, we have several people in the Old Testament who became believers in God and were told they didn't have to start following the law. The Queen of Sheba, she came and became a believer, apparently, in God because of Solomon, and she goes home. She didn't come up every year and bring tithes. No, she wasn't told to. There's another man. His name is Naaman. He was cured of leprosy. And he comes back and he says, hey, look, I'm cured. I'm a believer. But here's the thing. I'm going to go back and I have to go with my boss. He's the captain of the Assyrian army. I got to go with my boss, and he's going to go bow down in the temple of his God, and I've got to hold on to his arm and help him up and help him down, and it's going to look like I'm bowing down to the God. I want to know if it's okay. Is God going to strike me down for this? Because I'm a believer in the true God. And Elijah. Which one is it? I can't remember. Anyway, whatever it is, he says, look, I think it's Elisha. Anyway. He says, no, that's fine. Don't worry about it. No big deal. Why? Because you don't have to follow the Israelite law. You're a Gentile, right? You do have to follow the moral principles that God has for all people, but not all the details of the law are for all people. And, of course, that we know that's the case. So, yeah. Anyway, Deuteronomy 26 tells us that they were to pray for God's blessings on Israel because of their personal faithfulness in the tithe. So mark that down if you want to look that up yourself. Deuteronomy 26, 12 through 15. God was going to bless Israel because of their keeping of the tithe. And it was for a specific purpose. It was to benefit the Levitical priests and the poor and needy. If the tithe is a command for us today, then we need to go find Levitical priests and poor and needy people and give them 10% of our income. And really, we should give it to Jerusalem. And then also another 10% every 3 years to our local city to give out to the poor. You know, there's just no way that we could keep this command today. And so I think just by that alone, we would say, well, then we'd need a reiteration of the command in a new application to the church for us to say it's a command to the church. And we don't have that anywhere in the New Testament. It's just completely absent. Now, here's the danger of what I've taught today. What I've taught is, I think, just abundantly clear in the Scriptures. It's clear that God has not extended the command to tithe to the church. But what the danger is, now that I've torn down, what a lot of people think of when they think of giving to the church is, well, God wants us to tithe, and God's going to bless us financially if we give. Well, I've kind of torn down both of those. And now what's left is a vacuum. And I don't want that, because God has given us a command to give, and He has given us incentive to give. But He hasn't given us the command to give the tithe specifically, and He hasn't told us that the incentive is getting money back. But He has given us commands to give, and He has given us incentives. So next week we'll get to that. Okay, but we do need to fill in that void, right? Now we say, well, you've left this big vacuum, and I've got to fill it with something. Just wait a week, and then we'll fill it, okay? But at least that way you'll come next week hungry. Now, again, if you disagree, feel free to disagree. If your disagreement means you give more money to the church, definitely disagree. No, I'm just kidding. But the point is that I think, at least from this study, we should recognize that what we've already studied about giving should at least for now fill in that gap and say, look, giving ought to be something that is from our hearts because of what God has given to us, not because we're ordered or commanded to do it, but because of what else could we do it? What a privilege it is to be able to give. And that, of course, we'll talk more about next week. Any questions before we close? Yes?
There is, they don't refer to it as tithing, but there is talk in the New Testament of support. You know, Paul received support.
Yes.
A lot of them received support, and that there's a lot of that that's talked about in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So I think what we're given is support.
Amen. Yes, and we'll definitely talk about that. What are the three there's three categories of things that the money that came to the church was given to in the New Testament. And that doesn't mean we have to only use those categories, but those are obviously like patterns for us to follow. We'll talk about those next week. But yes, one of them is definitely Paul was supported, or at least some of the churches supported Paul. Paul wouldn't accept support from others. Yes, anyone else? Yeah.
So when they brought the sacrifice to the temple, the Levites, they had to give the sacrifice to the Levites. Was that part of the tithe too, or was that like supporting?
It could be, right? So if you're bringing your firstborn animal or something, whatever, and you're not going to redeem it, that's going to be a sacrifice, right? It depends on what the tithe was. If it was some of the tithes would be just like grain and corn and that kind of stuff, and that would be something that the Levites would use, they would eat. And some of the tithes, it just depends on what your business was and what it was that you were, because the people weren't bringing money so much. Again, remember that this is laying up your product. Again, it's another reason why it'd be very difficult to make this a command to the church. It'd be like, okay, Luke cuts wood for a living, so he's going to bring 10% of his wood and drop it off at the church, I don't know what to do with all that wood, right? So again, it's a little bit of it's difficult to translate from there to there. But yeah, some of them would be offerings, and you'd have to look through the details of each thing. And then there were other offerings that were because you sinned, or there were free will offerings. You'd offer an offering because you sinned, and you would say, "Okay, I'm going to offer this." Others are free will, just, "Hey, I'm just so grateful to God for all He's done. I'm going to give Him extra. I'm going to give an offering." And there was multiple things. And even some of those offerings that were like free will offerings, like part of the offering would be burned, another part would be set aside for the priests so that they could eat it. Yeah. It's a very, very interesting study, and there's, of course, much more to talk about in that. One day, we'll have to just do a whole study on the law. And it sounds boring, but it will be fun. But, by then, I'll have gray hair, and some of you might not be here. We'll see. We'll see. I'm not saying who. All right. Anyone else? All right. I've made enough people mad at me for tonight. Let's close. Father in heaven, I thank you so much for being so good to us. We thank you for your word. Thank you for the heart that we all have approaching your word, really desiring to see what you say and truly wanting to follow you. I pray that you'd help us as we consider this subject of giving, not to give for the wrong reasons because we feel some obligation that somebody has laid upon us, some human has laid upon us to give, but rather to give out of our abundance of gratefulness for what you have done for us. And Lord, how could we possibly give enough back to you for all that you've done to us? We can't. We just can't. And we thank you for every opportunity we have to give a small portion back to you. And we thank you even for the evening that we've had tonight, where we've been able to give of our time to the study of your word in a manner that we believe has been pleasing to you. We thank you for it. We pray that you help us to go from here rejoicing in your word and excited to learn more the next time. We pray these things in Jesus' name.